Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. This is Jason's Amazing Race Recap 38, episode number 6. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the Amazing Race Season 38, episode number 6. So if you're ready, let's get started. I said, if you're ready, let's get started. There we go. The 8 teams that are still left are in Dubrovnik, Croatia, or Croatia, as Jack from Jack and Chelsea called it. Tucker and Eric are the first ones to leave the pit stop because they were the first ones to arrive at the pit stop on the last leg, and they leave at 8:58 a.m. After gripping and ripping their clue, they found out they were headed to Trasteno Arboretum, which is about a half an hour drive according to my calculations. They had to self-drive themselves, and they had to use a manual transmission. So I believe this is the first time in this race that drivers had to use a manual transmission. And of course, if you've watched Amazing Race in past seasons, you know that manual transmissions can sometimes cause all kinds of problems, all kinds of drama, and even sometimes comedy as the drivers, forcing their way through trying to learn how to use the manual transmission. And not only do the drivers have to face that kind of drama, but it's also raining. So it's cold, it's raining, it's wet. I'm sure they're probably uncomfortable, and that'll make for a very interesting day for our racers. Kylan and Taylor were the second team to leave the pit stop, and they left at 9:24 a.m. That's about a half an hour after our leaders. And 10 minutes after them, Jazz and Jag left at 9:32 a.m. And when they saw that it was a manual transmission in the car, they were bragging about how they could drive anything because they drive big rigs, they deliver fuel in big trucks, they got their commercial driver's license, and they were excited to have a manual transmission. Of course, we know that sounds like a setup for something bad coming. And in fourth place, Joseph and Adam left the pit stop, and they were headed to the Arboretum as well. At the Arboretum, teams had to find the statue of Neptune hidden on the grounds and find their next clue. After arriving first and searching the grounds, Tucker and Eric found the statue, got their clue, and learned that they faced a detour. Either bag it up or pull it up. In bag it up, teams had to fill 10 bags with salt and make sure that each bag had between 20 and 21 pounds of salt in it. Then seal it using a little machine, and then carry those with a wheelbarrow back to another shed for checking by the local judge. In Pull It Up, teams had to row a boat out into the bay, find some buoys, lift 3 buoys up out of the water, and collect the oysters that were underneath. Both of these tasks were physical tasks. It just depended on whether you wanted to do it on land or you wanted to do it on the water. And in Bag It Up, you had to do it right the first time. Otherwise, you have to go back with the wheelbarrow, fill another bag or so, and take it all the way back again. So doing it right the first time was important. Pull It Up involved rowing, so you need to have a little bit of skill in order to do that. Tucker and Eric, they decided to do Bag It Up. They wanted to do that physical task on land. And when Jazz and Jag got their clue at the statue, they also decided to do Bag It Up. But when they went out to their car to back it up out of the parking spot, they had trouble finding reverse gear. Even after bragging so much about how they could drive anything, they had trouble. They couldn't figure out how to get into reverse. So they had to push the car backwards, manually get out and push the car, and in doing so, they almost pushed the car into a ditch. Luckily, there was a fence there, and the fence post prevented the car from going into the ditch. But what we have here is yet another example of teams bragging about how good they are at some tasks, and then finding out maybe they're not quite so good at it as they thought. Kylan and Taylor were the third team to arrive at the statue, and they decided to do Pull It Up. Now, Nat and Steph, they left the pit stop at 10:29 in 5th place. When Kylan and Taylor got into their boat, they had trouble rowing it. Normally you would sit backwards with your back facing to the front of the boat, the bow, and then pulling the oars towards you to make it go. But in this case, he sat the opposite way and he was trying to push the oars to make it go, and that just doesn't work. And when Nat and Steph got in their car and started driving, they too had trouble finding reverse gear. But they stopped and they asked one of the locals for some help, and he told them that you have to push down on the gear lever, then move it over into reverse. Now that's a lockout feature because you don't want to accidentally shift into reverse while you're driving. So some cars have a lockout feature where you have to do something special, like lift the lever on the gear shift handle, or in this case on Volkswagens, push it down, move it over, and go into reverse. And Natalie said that getting that guy's help was clutch. What a pun that was. And Tucker and Eric in first place, they finished their salt task without too much difficulty, and their clue was route info to a nearby park in a small town. Back on the water, Kylan and Taylor still struggled to row their boat, and it didn't look like Taylor was helping a whole lot. Tucker and Eric were the first ones to find that park, and they found out by the clue that they had to memorize some facts about Croatia. It involved running around that little village looking for 3 signs. Each one had facts about Croatia on it, and they had to memorize those facts and then go back to the local judge, answer 3 questions correctly before they could get their next clue. The trick here was that each time you attempted to answer those questions, the questions changed. And the other trick was that you also had to include the units with the answer. For example, if it said 6,007, you had to include feet, 6,007 feet. If you didn't include feet in there, then it was wrong. It reminded me a little bit of Monty Python in the Holy Grail when they came upon that bridge and the bridge keeper, and you had to answer 3 questions in order to get across the bridge. But each time one of the knights went up to answer the questions changed. Back at the pit stop, Jack and Chelsea left at 11:29 a.m. and off they went to find the Arboretum and the statue of Neptune. Tucker and Eric took 2 attempts to get the Croatian facts correct, but they did finish fairly quickly, and next they learned they were off to the pit stop. Now, on their clue that told them to head to the pit stop, it said that whichever team came in last may be eliminated. And they picked this up pretty quickly, that perhaps this is a non-elimination leg. Normally you might hear the clue say something like will be eliminated, but in this case it said may be eliminated. So several teams picked that up and thought there might be some hope that this was a non-elimination leg. Izzy and Paige, they left the pit stop that morning at 11:47 in 7th place. And Izzy was doing some more Jag and Jazz bashing, which she has been doing a lot of here. And we also see Jack and Chelsea having navigational issues again. That's a common theme with them. They always seem to struggle with navigation. So much so that they pulled into a parking lot, thought they could get out through a gate, but the gate didn't lift for them, so they had to back the car up all the way back up through the parking lot to get back out again. That was kind of funny. And Kylan and Taylor, they did finish the oyster task, and off they went to the park. And Taylor decided that she was going to do that task, but she ended up outsmarting herself on that. She decided to go and ask the questions first. That way she knew what facts to go look for. Now, this has been done by other teams in the past when they have things to memorize. They will go to the judge, ask the questions, knowing that they don't know the answers, but at least they know what questions now to go search for. So that's what she decided to do, was to find out what questions would be asked and then only memorize those answers. Now, I believe that the Amazing Race folks anticipated this. And knowing full well that these racers are pretty smart, they probably have watched past episodes, have done their homework, and so they did their best to try to prevent that from happening by changing up the questions with each attempt. After running around that little village and memorizing only the question she heard the first time, she went back to the judge, who asked her different questions. It was then that she knew that she had messed up. So she had to go back, find all those signs all over again, and memorize all the facts not knowing which questions would be asked. And that cost them a little bit of time, and she was kind of mad at herself that she thought she had outsmarted the game, but the game had outsmarted her. And finally, in last place, 4 hours after the leaders had left the pit stop, Christine and Rubina left the pit stop. And Tucker and Eric were the first ones to arrive at the pit stop this leg. And at the pit stop, they saw a deep sea diver, which they said looked like a statue. And I think that might have some implications in the finale. We'll see. But for coming in first, they won a 5-night stay in Cairo, Egypt, which looked like that would be pretty fun. Meanwhile, back at the park, Jazz and Jag didn't fall for the same trap that Taylor fell into, and he was able to figure out that the questions did change each time there was an attempt to try to answer them. When off they went to the pit stop where they came in second, with Kylan and Taylor coming in third. And as the race continued, teams worked through their tasks and completed them and moved on to the next ones. But one thing I thought was interesting was Nat and Steph. So, they had been part of that alliance, the Trainwreck Alliance, with Jazz and Jag and Joseph and Adam. And in this particular case, they were hemming and hawing here about whether they should help or wait on Joseph and Adam, with Natalie feeling some loyalty there that she should wait for Joseph and Adam so they could travel together. Now, Steph, on the other hand, is recognizing here, or she's questioning the value of that alliance. And she was thinking that it just doesn't make any sense to go backwards, to go back in a race to wait on another team. That you always should be moving forward, that it's a competition, it's a race. And she was having a hard time understanding that, which I agree with. I think it's a race. I don't think that you should be going backwards in a race to help another team. That just seems counter to the whole point of it all. So we may see more of that. We may see more conflict between Nat and Steph on how much they should keep their loyalty to that alliance. Eventually, they're going to have to break it. You come down to the finale, and it's a race, and you're just not going to help another team then. So if we take a look at the two teams that were U-turned in the last leg, which were Izzy and Paige and Christine and Rubina, it was Izzy and Paige who came in 7th place this leg, despite having all the trouble they did with the salt task, with getting their bags to seal properly, with carrying them in the wheelbarrow and the wheelbarrow falling over. They ended up coming in 7th. And Christine and Rubina's only hope was for it to be a non-elimination leg. They came in last and were eliminated because we ended up finding out that it was an elimination leg. So I think the producers were trying to throw another curveball in there by giving people hope, by giving us in the audience, the impression that it was going to be a non-elimination leg. But in the end, Christine and Rubina were eliminated. And without there being an equalizer on this leg, being 4 hours behind, Christine and Rubina really didn't have much of a chance. It was either going to be a non-elimination leg or an equalizer that was going to save them. They just couldn't catch up, being 4 hours behind all the others. Okay, let's talk about my impressions, my insights into this particular leg. Well, one, it was a rainy day, but teams did seem to be prepared. They did have some rain jackets, most of them did anyway, and seemed prepared for the rainy day. Now, I'm sure it wasn't very comfortable. It was probably cold and wet and, clammy, and that made for some difficult racing today. But that's different than we had seen before. We had seen just some cold days, but here it was a cold and rainy day. And as I had mentioned, there was no equalizers on this particular leg. Izzy and Paige did survive another leg. If there is, I believe there will be another equalizer coming up, and Izzy and Paige will get right back being equal with Jazz and Jag, the team that had U-turned them, and give them some hope in being able to U-turn in the future, Jazz and Jag. So we'll see how that goes. But it didn't help, Christine and Rubina on that without unless they had an equalizer. All right, we had another leg here where we only really had 2 tasks to do. This is the 3rd time I count that in this race where racers only did 2 tasks per leg. And typically what I have seen is 3 tasks per leg. And the manual transmission still gets racers. And we know that there's only around 18% of US drivers know how to drive a manual transmission. But again, these racers are savvy. They know they're coming on the race. They know from watching past races that they probably will face a manual transmission or have to drive a car with a manual transmission. And so they practice. So they go out before the race and they learn how to drive. And if you've ever driven a manual transmission, it's not something you can learn quickly. It does take a while to get the practice, to get the hang of it. And we saw that. We saw that with trying to get into reverse. A simple little task, putting a car into reverse, and they couldn't figure that out. So that always leads to comedy and drama, and it gets racers every single time. And the Trainwreck Alliance, we will see more of that disintegration. We know it's going to happen. We know that alliances have to break up by the end of the race. And so we will just watch that unfold. And that should be quite entertaining to see that. Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up for this particular episode. Thanks for joining. As always, I do appreciate you listening in. But join me next time for Jason's Amazing Race Recap 38, episode number 7. And we will see what happens with our racers during the next leg. See you then.